Support comes from St. Louis Public Library Foundation, helping the library serve children and their families with programs and services needed to become lifelong readers. More information about the foundation is at slpl.org.
This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. In cities like Baltimore, Dallas, and Los Angeles, electronic monitoring is on the rise. St. Louis is among those cities, and it has followed that upward trend. Over a 4-year period starting in 2021, the use of electronic monitoring for defendants awaiting trial has more than doubled. Advocates say it's a way to prevent overcrowding in jails and to keep people from being imprisoned while awaiting trial for minor offenses. But opponents who cite technological mishaps, as well as privacy concerns and high costs, call electronic monitoring's efficacy into question. They also point out that many people who are forced to wear the devices would have otherwise been out on cash bail. Journalist Taylor Tiamoyo Harris is an investigative fellow for the New York Times and is based in St. Louis. Her story on this topic was co-published yesterday by the New York Times and St. Louis Public Radio. And Taylor joins me now. Welcome back to the show, Taylor.
Thank you for having me, and glad to be here.
Yes. So, Taylor, the last time that you were on our show was last May, and you spoke about a story you reported on the juvenile justice system. What was it, though, that got you interested in turning your journalistic lens to electronic monitoring?
Right. So what got me started with electronic monitoring? Well, I'm a criminal justice reporter here in St. Louis. I've worked for different outlets and been published with different outlets here. So I have sources on the beat. I keep in touch with people in the community. I'm community centered. So I had reported on monitoring. I reported a little bit on isolated incidents. I brought it up in the reporting and Daniel Riley, things like that. And I'm like, okay, these are some of the isolated incidents. What are concerns from the community? So people were telling me like, hey, yeah, it's about monitoring. I got some other topics that people gave me, but in doing the pre-reporting, talking to people around the scope of this issue, talking to court officials, attorneys, people again in the community, and people on monitors, the pre-reporting told me like this is an issue that the community wants to learn more about. So.
Mm-hmm. Now, before we take a deep dive into your piece, Taylor, I'd love for you to introduce us to someone you talked to. You know, you mentioned community, someone that you talked to for your story, and her name is Kyla Mason. Tell us about her, Taylor.
Kyla, yes. So Kyla is someone, I met when I was going to those pretrial bond hearings. They have them every day. And I go to those hearings and typically, I'm looking down, I'm looking at someone's ankle to see, I need more sources. I think I followed more than 25 people or around that amount that were on monitors. So when I saw Kyla, I just saw a young woman with a monitor. I saw that we were in court. And there was discussion, like a clear up about something like, oh, her battery wasn't working, or, she was unclear about instructions. And in my head, I'm like, okay, let's go after her. So I, with everyone else, even with Kyla, I approached her, told her who I was, what I was looking into, and I wanted to know more about her lived experience with monitors. Mm-hmm. And, initially, I have them fill out like this tracker. I want to know more about what they're experiencing, similarities, and just have a conversation as well. And so, yeah, she decided to open up to me, and we ended up following Kyla from that moment. Even still now, I texted her the article yesterday and talked to her. But yes, just seeing how her case disposed and the ups and downs of her case and getting to know her attorneys and going to court hearings with her. Yeah, that process. I'm glad I got an up close and personal view. So I'm glad I, had that access and trust with her.
Mm-hmm. So her circumstances, what was it that put her in a place where she had an ankle monitor assigned to her?
So, yeah, that was, of course, that's the first question you ask because no one just has a monitor just to have one, right? These are people that are accused of crime. So I'm asking her, what are you accused of? What are you facing charges for? And one of the reasons why we decided to go with Kyla. She was upfront about everything, the circumstances of her case. She let us know, hey, yes, there was an incident. My personal opinion, yes, it was self-defense. Yes, I did have a gun, and I'm legally allowed to carry. And so we had this conversation about like what happened, what was captured. We even went as far as, trying to be as objective as possible. I went and saw the video myself of what happened in the situation. We had countless conversations about her perspective. And again, she claims it was self-defense. And I also talked to her attorney, and he told me, he was like, even if she was found guilty, this is her first offense that she's been charged with. So she likely is not even looking at jail time. So that was just someone I was like, okay, one of many sources I found. We found some people who had extensive criminal records as well, but this was just an example of, this is a young woman. It's her first time in the justice system. Let's see how this fares out for her.
And the video that you saw, what was depicted there?
Right. So the video just depicted her having an argument. It was exactly what we described in the article, because that's what she told me, and that was described in court. She was arguing. There were people going back and forth. She had her, weapon and told and warned people like, hey, don't come near me. And so I was like, okay, well, I do understand what you're telling me as far as self-defense. But, ultimately, how her case disposed, she was let off the monitor. She had a suspended probation. So the court also saw that this was not a case that needed jail time. So,
and to be very clear, it was a low-level offense. She was charged with unlawful use of a weapon, right?
She was.
So there was no discharge of the firearm?
She did not fire.
Okay. Now, Kyla Mason, she did violate the terms of her monitoring more than 24 times. But what did she tell you about why that happened?
Again, also trust in credibility with sources, and there's no such thing as a perfect source, right? And so I knew that, did I know that there were potential issues with people with, backfiring, not charging, things like that? Were there instances where people, I went and got my hair done. Yeah, I went to the movies, and people that were forthcoming with that information, those are typically the people that I worked with. I want them to tell me, okay, well, why did you intentionally violate? In some cases, initially with Kyla, when I met her, she was in court and was telling like, okay, there was a miscommunication because it isn't just the monitor, it's also the program, which is house arrest. Now, there were people who were on the monitor who said like, I didn't have house arrest, so it wasn't an issue. It's just like, this monitor on your leg and what's associated with that. But typically the issues came with house arrest. And when it tells you can and cannot leave the house, there were times when she's like, hey, I'm a single mother, I'm providing for my son. So if it says that I can't leave after 8, but I need to go get diapers, she's like, I'm going to get diapers. She was forthcoming with that information.
Right. And there's also an instance in which she had to take her child to the hospital?
There was. She told me about that, in that it was past her curfew. It was late at night. She stayed overnight, and she did receive a violation for it. They did discuss it in court. But one of the things is you never know how a judge is going to decide on the violations. I've had attorneys tell me like, they tried to call and say like, they were home, but the monitor was messing up. They used phone records to try to prove, because someone's not at that pretrial office 24/7.
Right.
There are 4 to 5 people monitoring, hundreds at a time. So.
Right. I mean, people, of course, as you said, are imperfect. I mean, are there ways or exceptions, for certain kinds of violations, to let your court-appointed monitor know of special circumstances, like needing to get diapers or to go to the hospital?
Right. The process of, there are issues with your monitor, the process, the rule states in contracts that, you inform the office. You keep that line of communication open. That's something that the monitoring company and also pretrial services themselves have been working on. One of the things I think the monitoring company told me was that they switched to a 314 number because they would at times reach out to people about violations or issue with monitor, but it was an 800 number and they weren't familiar. So, they established their office here. They had a procedure. But again, what ultimately happens with monitors and your violations, that's on the judge's discretion. If they believe that you had an emergency, if you have proof of it, your attorney, how convincing they are, the prosecutors. So it's at the judge's discretion.
Did you get any sense, Taylor, that had it not been for the ankle monitor that Kyla Mason was forced to wear, that she would have been kept in jail before her trial?
I would believe under the law as it currently stands, and I believe I had this conversation with her attorney and other attorneys, that it would have been a cash bail set. I named the factors so the audience was familiar in that, this is a first-time offender. It's her first charge. It was not per se a violent charge. I would believe that under Missouri law, likely she would have been issued a cash bond before these new initiatives starting in 2019.
Right. What is it that happened to Kyla as a result of the violations of her conditions of release?
Right. She did not adhere to them in all ways, again, sometimes intentional, sometimes out of desperation. But Kyla ultimately was sent back to jail because of the number of violations. And it's noted on her court record. What I thought was interesting was that, and she told me, she's like, well, I didn't always have the opportunity to explain the violations and what I was doing in her case. So it was the quantity of the violations that the judge looked at and determined, hey, she's bad on bond. I let you out on bond. You don't have a cash bond. You have a monitor. The judge sees, hey, all these violations. And so that decision was made. Kyla went back to jail for about a month. During that time, unfortunately, she was not paying rent. She was evicted. So ultimately that's what happened.
Right. Taylor, let's take a step back here. Kyla Mason wore an ankle monitor, but there are other forms of electronic monitoring. And at one point in your piece, you mentioned people needing to download an app. What is that about?
So the app, that's actually something, ironically, that when I talked to Total Court Services, which is the monitoring company, they told me, hey, we're reform oriented. And I was like, oh, really? And they're like, yeah, that's why we have this new app, because we do realize some of the complaints about monitoring. And so this app is supposed to give you court logins. They do have a version of an app. I'm not sure also, though, in St. Louis or County that there's a version of an app that, can scan your background and also scan your face to make sure you are where you are. So the app has tracking capabilities, but it's not as extensive as the monitor, which can, be 24/7.
Right. I'm talking with Taylor Tiamoyo Harris. She is a St. Louis-based journalist and investigative fellow for the New York Times. Her story, titled Amid Calls to Reform Bail, Judges in St. Louis Embrace Ankle Monitors, was co-published yesterday by the New York Times and St. Louis Public Radio. Taylor, there are a number of arguments that advocates make in favor of electronic monitoring, and one is that they keep people out of jail. Before we get to St. Louis, can you give us a sense, Taylor, of how this issue of electronic monitoring is playing out in other cities?
Right, sure. So we can, talk about Baltimore. They have electronic monitoring in pretrial. And I want to also place that emphasis on pretrial because monitoring has been around for decades. We've seen it, and typically it was associated with parole and probation, and even, some higher offenses like sex crimes. But, again, we wanted to focus on, it's now in pretrial before innocence or guilt is determined.
Sure.
So, Baltimore, New York, we've also seen in Dallas, we've seen in Chicago. We've seen all these states that are moving toward a cashless bail system. A lot of them are leaning heavier on electronic monitoring. We do have a situation currently in San Francisco. There's a federal suit. Monitoring is issued by the government is kind of on hold because the sheriffs actually wanted to conduct warrantless searches for people that were on monitors, making them subject to searches at any and every time while on monitors. And so there were some constitutional questions about that. The ACLU filed suit. So, this monitoring situation is being played out all over courts and really just all over cities. The problems from them, the oversight, just looking closely into what is this new technology that we now have and how is it faring out?
We've talked about cash bail on the show before and, what advocates say about that and how cash bail punishes those, especially who are not able to pay bond in order to get out. I mean, keeping people out of jail is one of the reasons supporters say electronic monitoring is a beneficial thing. I mean, generally, though, are advocates of justice reform, are they pleased with the results?
With the results of monitoring?
And keeping people out of jail?
Well, I would say that most of criminal justice advocates, sources I know here just in the St. Louis community, no, are not. And even some of the advocates nationally that I've met and interviewed and included in the story, they're not. They call it a digital prison, right? They are not happy with the fact that, we went from, the cash bail system to now, again, St. Louis covers most of the costs now for monitors, but we have people suffering who cannot afford to pay the monitors. We have people subject to conditions that they were not under the cash bail. So I think we have more than enough reason to question, is this a reform and is it working? And those are some of the questions that were posed to me. I think we have a quote from Blake in there, from Art City, who says, hey, was the trade-off worth it? Mm-hmm. And that's the question that a lot of people are asking now.
Right. I mentioned in the introduction, Taylor, that St. Louis's use of electronic monitoring of defendants, again, awaiting trial, pre-trial, that it more than doubled over a 4-year period starting in 2021. And your analysis shows that it surpassed 550 people. You spoke with the city's public defender, Matthew Mahaffey. What is it that he said about that argument, about the benefits of electronic monitoring?
Right. In some cases, I would say let's start off overall. Overall, I believe he and just many of the others in the public defender's office and many attorneys, they all felt as though it was an overreach at times, and that a lot of people felt as though it was a default and it didn't need to be. And by what I mean by that is, when someone's charged with a crime, they have that initial bond hearing that, they were saying, prosecutors are, arguing for no bond. And then if allowed bond, if a judge is kind of insistent on it, it seemed to them as that it was the default and it didn't need to be. Mm-hmm. With that 75% number that I found at one point. And again, it fluctuates. The percentage of people let out on bond on monitors, it fluctuates every month. The court has monthly pretrial reports that we refer to. But I think the consensus was that many felt as though it was overreach and that people who, again, would have been out on a cash bond and not subject to these rules are now having additional issues. Those particularly, I would say, he pointed out issues with the unhoused community, them not having an opportunity to keep it charged. Or I even talked to one victim who's the perpetrator was her son, and she still wanted to help him. And she's like, they put him on a monitor, but they put him on a monitor to a house that's abandoned. That's not even his real house. So, there are problems I'm hearing from people all around these issues. And again, being inclusive about what survivors and victims want as well.
Mm-hmm. As part of your reporting, you talked earlier about sitting in on dozens of pretrial bond hearings, and these are meant to determine whether a person who has been arrested, that is, will be released or held in jail. You said a lot of people were there who did talk to you. Why were they so willing to speak? Did you have to do any cajoling in order to get them to talk with you?
Yeah, that was like the big circle around this story because it was like, okay, how are we going to get people? We tried all different methods just to be, transparent about. I initially would look at the court docket and try to find people and make calls. No one returned my calls. So then it was like, okay, well, let's go to the courthouse. Let's go directly to this issue. Where else are we going to find people? So why were they so open? I think I was there. I mean, some of these people I didn't always talk to initially. They might have saw me for their first court date and then their second. Some people, I sat by them in court. We talked. I explained who I was. I explained like, hey, I haven't determined what my viewpoint is, but I want to make sure that I'm accurately capturing what you're experiencing and what you're going through from a firsthand perspective. And people, they want to share. They want to have a voice. And I told them initially like, hey, right now, it's on background. I do want to keep track of your case, your charges, and your concerns. But, if I want to go deeper, again, with Kyla, with James, with David, then I will. But most of them, I think it was over like 24 people I talked to. I mean, we just decided with 3 characters for this story.
Yeah.
But I think they opened up over time. With Kyla, I'll be honest, I had lost track of her. I didn't know she got sent back to jail for those monitors. And I'm like, where's my person? This is like a good source I was talking to. I found her mom. And she didn't tell her mom she was talking to a reporter, but I explained to her, again, who I am, what I'm trying to do. And so her mom opened up and we ended up talking. So, I don't know. I feel like that's one of my superpowers is getting people close to the issue, getting them to open up and talk about, what's going on in their lives.
At those pretrial bond hearings, was there anything that you observed that shed some light on why this change started in 2021? What the court process was like, and what was factoring into judges' considerations?
Right. The first thing that pops up into my head, I always hear this rhetoric, is least restrictive. I think it was the former Missouri Supreme Court Justice Zell Fisher issued that mandate in 2019. Again, we're trying to, this is in the spirit of bail reforms happening all over the country, lessen the jail, overcrowding the jail, but also that campaign against cash bail, led by many advocates here in St. Louis, Missouri, and also nationwide. And hey, charging someone or someone being too poor not to afford to get out of jail, thinking that, unconstitutional, that's not fair. So that directive in 2019, hey, consider the least restrictive means. That's really, I believe, how we got here to monitoring, because it's like, okay, well, maybe this person does not have to be jailed. Maybe that's, not the least restrictive means. But I think, again, we started getting to, okay, well, how do we ensure that the people that we let out with pending criminal charges, how do we ensure community safety?
Yeah.
And I think that that's how that became like a viable option.
Yeah. Now, you'd wanted to talk with a judge, and specifically presiding judge of the 22nd Judicial Circuit Court, Judge Christopher McGraw, and a court spokesperson declined your interview request. What is it that you wanted to ask Judge McGraw?
We wanted to get just a better idea of the court's understanding of electronic monitoring, because it is a court-ran program. This is run out of the pretrial office. Judges are the ones that are implementing this. I wanted to hear straight from the judges. I mean, it was the presiding judge, but also other judges on the bench I also wanted to hear from. But since they referred to, the court's office and the presiding judge, I'm like, well, why not? Let's hear it from the top. We did get responses from the court and also the pretrial office that we included in the story. But we want to know, are you aware of some of the concerns? How are we implementing this? You're leaning heavier on it. It's more money now from the budget. So obviously this is an interest to the court, and we just wanted to hear directly from the court on that. It's one thing for me to sit in multiple courtrooms and observe, and not just even at the bond hearings. I'll just go to other hearings as well, because, the bond hearings are the initial hearings before, the case is or is not indicted. And so I saw how the case played out in other judges' courtrooms as well. And I asked those judges, it wasn't just the presiding judge who we asked. And, that was something the judges kind of just wanted to, hey, just observe me in court. That's what they preferred. And, still able to make the story happen and also just offer their viewpoint. I was happy to have reached Judge Mullen and recently retired, so able to get that viewpoint in there.
Now, we should note, and this is something that is pointed out in your story, that the St. Louis court has done more than most to make the monitors less disruptive to defendants' lives. What's the difference between the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County, Taylor?
Right. I would even make the argument that it's not even just a city-county comparison, but like St. Louis, I would say the pretrial office has done more than most that I've observed just around the country. Right now, they have the contract attorneys, and I have to go back. I'm not sure if that one made it into the a story, but I talked to many contract attorneys. Those are the attorneys that the city allocated in the budget for those initial bond hearings. And so these are just private attorneys all around the area who weekly, most of the time people don't have representation when they are initially arrested for that initial bond hearing, which again, according to the 2019 directive, happens at 48 hours, 2 days, and then 1 week. And so most people don't have an attorney at that time. So Now, the court provides an attorney. They do a pretrial risk assessment, letting, the attorney's able to view that most of the time a few minutes before. They may have 10 people that day. They're reviewing, okay, this person, this is their education, their background, their criminal history, their work history, their family, things to, make their case to the court. It's not just them telling the judge, like, I want to get out and my mom is here. You have a attorney in place. And so we see that difference between the city and county. The money. St. Louis, again, initially they were not covering these costs. I think it was until about 2 years ago they began covering now about 90%, if not most, if not all, of the cost of electronic monitoring. We don't see that in the county. I have had attorneys express to me, how much this weighs down on people. This is $400 a month, if not more, that people have to pay until their case disposes. And not everyone is able to keep up with those payments.
Right. Another person you spoke with, Taylor, was David Hemphill. Now, the circumstances around his charges, he'd led police on a 30-minute chase and was arrested and was forced to wear an ankle monitor for a few months. But he told you that the officer who had initiated the stop was actually a neighbor and that he did not trust the police. And ultimately, the charges against David Hemphill were dropped. I mean, what was the effect of electronic monitoring on David Hemphill's life?
Right. So the effect on monitoring, David and I, we had several conversations. I actually met him through his attorney. I didn't meet him in court per se. But life for David. David talked to me. He's a home contractor. He's very good with his hands. He's like, when I go into someone's home and they see this thing on my leg, he's like, people don't hire people that they're scared of. Like they don't want me in their homes. And so he felt as though like he received, less contracts for his work. And so he less money, depressed, even just sharing with me that he didn't realize how widespread this was. A lot of people think like, oh, I'm just dealing with this. Then they look around and see other people, again, with pending charges who have monitors. He told me he realized that, he was just working one day and kind of realized that after his monitor was off, that all his guys on his team, had some monitors and they were talking about some of their pending charges. And we had some transparent conversations about that. You brought up his charge and with the neighbor and with police. I really, I fought to include David and even James's story also in there. Those were both people, yes, that led police on chases. And I wanted to do that. Why? Because that was what the data reflective was showing me. I was seeing a lot of resisting charges and fleeing charges. And, whether you agree with them or not, I'm like, it's happening. Right. We need to hear from people, at least those who are willing to talk. I mean, why is this happening? What's going on? What's behind this? And I wanted, the audience to also hear from them as well. So
I think that the social impact or effects is something that, as I was reading, really came out very strongly, and that it's a stigma for people who have not been convicted of a crime. We started the conversation, Taylor, talking about Kyla Mason. A St. Louis mother was charged with unlawful use of a weapon, and she had to wear an ankle monitor. There were violations of terms of her release, and she did ultimately spend about a month, as you said, in jail. What is it that happened with her, and is there anything about that you want to further look into in future work?
About her specific case, not necessarily. I typically do keep in contact with my sources. They have information to give with me. But yes, I do want to follow electronic monitoring. I mean, she's no longer on the monitor. If she were to get back on it, then yeah, we would talk. But I want to follow this issue and the people connected to this issue. So, all three people that I included in my story at this point, they're now all off the monitor. So I think we'll find more people that are closely connected with this issue. Answering the part about, what happened with Kyla, her case was disposed. She ended up getting an SIS suspended sentence. Is basically plain terms is, stay out of trouble for this set period of time. I think it's 2 years. And then, this case, I think will be dismissed as an SIS. And so you have to stay away, stay out of trouble, future charges, I believe, police contact. And so that avoids jail time.
Yeah. Taylor Tiamoyo Harris is a St. Louis-based journalist and investigative fellow for the New York Times. Her story, titled Amid Calls to Reform Bail, Judges in St. Louis Embrace Ankle Monitors, was co-published yesterday by the New York Times and St. Louis Public Radio. Thank you so much for being here, Taylor.
Thank you for having me.
Today's episode was produced by our executive producer, Alex Hoyer.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.